On July 1st of 1863, one of the most crucial battles of the American Civil War began. This battle was the Battle of Gettysburg, which was a major turning point of the Civil War. Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia marched into Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Union Major General George G. Meade and his Army of the Potomac met the Confederates at the Pennsylvania crossroads town of Gettysburg. Not always seen before on other battlefields, the Union Army fought with desperation. Despite initial Confederate success, the battle turned on July 3rd, and with few options remaining, Robert E. Lee ordered his army back to Virginia. The Union victory at the Battle of Gettysburg resulted not only in Lee's retreat to Virginia, but an end to hopes of Confederacy for independence.
Before the Battle of Gettysburg, the Civil War had been going on for 2 years. The Civil War was pretty much fought over one main reason: slavery. In 1819, Alabama was admitted as a slave state, bringing the number of slave states and free states to equal numbers. There was a small discussion between U.S. government officials on slavery until 1820. The Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. The compromise also prohibited slavery in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase north of Missouri. In 1827, New York made slavery illegal. In 1830, the Underground Railroad was established, which helped slaves escape from slavery in the South to freedom in the North. Harriet Tubman helped free many slaves with the Underground Railroad and was an abolitionist and a Union spy. A Baptist slave preacher, Nat Turner, led a revolt in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. This raid killed at least 57 whites, and after the battle, Alabama made it illegal for blacks to preach. In 1846, Dred Scott and his wife Harriet filed suit for their freedom in the St. Louis Circuit Court. The suit began an 11-year legal fight that ended in the U.S. Supreme Court. This decision contributed to rising tensions between this free and slave state just before the war. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Law enacted. Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, talking about the problems with slavery. It forever changed how Americans viewed slavery. It also demanded that the United States deliver the promise of freedom and equality.
In 1859, John Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The Confederates won this battle and captured 12,000 Union soldiers. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, only receiving about 40% of the popular vote. His position was to prevent slavery from extension into Western territories, but many Southerners feared he threatened the peculiar institution of slavery. Although personally opposed to slavery, President Lincoln said the Civil War is to be fought to preserve the Union. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. 10 more states seceded from the Union after South Carolina, including Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. Texas joined 1 month after February 4, 1861. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined the Confederacy after the shelling of Fort Sumter. This formed the Confederacy. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland were the border states. These were states that allowed slavery, and there was some concern that they would leave the Union. Bull Run, the first battle of the Civil War, was fought in 1861. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary proclamation. It stated that slaves should be free and that any slave seeking freedom would not be stopped by government action. Officially taking effect January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation declared that slaves in areas of rebellion were free. Many slaves fled north.
Even though the Confederacy had most of the victories in the East, they still had problems. The Union still had superior numbers and more material, and the South had economy issues. Robert E. Lee proposed a second invasion of the North that could have relieved the Confederate capital of Richmond, and given his soldiers an opportunity to forage supplies from the Pennsylvania countryside. After Confederate President Jefferson Davis agreed, Lee started marching his Army of Northern Virginia north on June 3, 1863. Union General George Meade's thoughts about taking the offensive made him a top candidate to be the fighting general that President Abraham Lincoln had desperately sought since the war's onset. Meade was given command of the Army of Potomac less than the week before the Battle of Gettysburg. Both generals didn't plan to fight at Gettysburg, but they clashed early morning of July 1, 1863. A Union brigade encountered 2 brigades of advancing Confederate troops with breech-loading carbines. The Union troops were capable of getting off 8 shots per minute to the Confederates' 3. Despite smaller numbers, the Union's technology held the Confederates at bay. Quickly, both sides called for reinforcements, and the battle picked up. The Union had the advantage because they were on their own turf and had more soldiers.
The night of July 1st, the Union had set up an official defense line, and Lee planned to break through it. The next day, some of the most horrific fighting at Gettysburg took place at Devil's Den. Located downhill from Little Round Top, the Devil's Den changed hands 3 times during the 3-day battle. The heaviest fighting came that afternoon, as an estimated 5,000 soldiers were fighting for the high ground. By the end of the afternoon, an estimated 1,800 men were killed, wounded, or missing, a casualty rate of more than 33%. The casualties were far worse than any other battle of the Civil War. The final day of fighting at Gettysburg, July 3, 1863, Lee ordered 12,000 men to attack the center of the Federal line. Pickett's division, along with several others, were ordered to cover more than 1,000 yards across open ground towards entrenched Federal positions. When the advancing Confederates got to within about 400 yards, Union artillerists opened fire. Some soldiers got as far as the line, but within an hour after it had begun, more than 6,500 Confederate soldiers lay dead or dying in the field. Pickett's charge was as far north as the Confederate Army ever reached. This battle was often referred to as the high water mark of the rebellion. The Union won this battle with knowledge and force.
The Battle of Gettysburg brought devastation to the residents of Gettysburg. Every farm, field, or garden was a graveyard. Churches, public buildings, and even private homes were hospitals filled with wounded soldiers. Not only were buildings destroyed, farm and food supplies were taken by troops. Sometimes they paid, but the Confederates paid in Confederate money, which could not be spent in the North. It was a costly victory. The Union had finally won an important battle, though, and momentum switched to the Union side. When the Union had the momentum on their side, they won many battles after Gettysburg, and it gave a morale boost to Union troops and government officials. Confederate troops retreated and went into a mostly defensive posture for the remainder of the war. If the Union lost the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederates could have possibly taken over Washington, D.C., and then maybe even the war. The pressure on the Union government was immediately relieved as the Confederate forces retreated and no longer threatened cities such as Philadelphia, Baltimore, or Washington, D.C. Both sides were heavily in debt because of supplying armies with guns, bullets, and knives. With the Union winning at Gettysburg, this led to the end of the Civil War, with the Union winning. The Civil War ended slavery and ruined the Confederates' chance for their own country.
The Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War and really changed the whole outcome of the war. The Battle of Gettysburg also had far more casualties than any other battle of the Civil War. Prominent Gettysburg residents became concerned with the poor condition of soldiers' graves scattered over the battlefield and at hospital sites, and pleaded with Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin for state support to purchase a portion of the battlefield to set aside as a final resting place for the defenders of the Union cause. On November 19, 1863, a dedication ceremony for fallen soldiers at Gettysburg was held and included solemn prayers and songs. Later, famous orator Edward Everett followed an elaborate procession to the cemetery with a 2-hour speech. Abraham Lincoln then rose, pulled out 2 sheets of paper that he had been working on diligently for more than a month, and gave a speech that lasted about 2 minutes. During that short time, he spoke the words that raised the purpose of the war to a higher level, the rebirth of freedom for all. Not only did Gettysburg have an impact on the war, it had one in the reminiscences and histories of the war written in future years.
The Battle of Gettysburg, which was a major turning point of the Civil War. This battle turned Robert E. Lee's army back to Virginia. Since Lee retreated, it no longer threatened cities like Washington, D.C. It was the biggest and bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. If it weren't for the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln would have never gave the famous Gettysburg Address, one of the most inspirational speeches ever. The Union victory at the Battle of Gettysburg resulted not only in Lee's retreat to Virginia, but an end to hopes for Confederacy. It also raised hope for slaves.